She told him the truth she'd been carrying for years, the thing that had cost her everything before. He listened without a word. Then he picked up a shovel. Kansas, in the autumn of 1874, was a country of tall grass and hard-won order, and it was on a modest half-section outside the town of Larkin that Marigold Vance had spent the better part of a year keeping house for a rancher named Levi Pike, a quiet arrangement of honest work and honest wages that had grown, by slow and careful degrees neither of them had rushed, into something considerably warmer than either had planned for. Marigold was 27, and she had arrived in Larkin the autumn before with nothing but a small trunk and a past she had told no one the whole of, having fled 2 years prior, from a broken engagement in Ohio that had ended in the cruelest fashion a young woman's hopes could end. She had loved a man named Wendell Ashcroft with her whole earnest heart, and had believed herself settled for a happy, ordinary life, until a physician's careful examination, sought after 2 years of marriage, failed to quicken with child, revealed that Marigold would very likely never bear children at all, and Wendell's mother, upon learning the news, had informed her son plainly that a wife who could not secure the family line was no wife worth keeping, whatever affection he imagined he felt for her. Wendell had not fought for her. He had accepted the annulment his mother arranged with a speed that told Marigold everything she needed to know about the true depth of a love she had trusted entirely, and she had left Ohio with her heart in ruins and a private conviction, carried ever since, that any man who learned the truth of her would eventually make the same calculation Wendell had. Levi Pike was 46, a widower these 2 years. His wife Clara having died of a wasting illness after 15 years of a marriage that had never once produced a child of their own, not from any tragedy or lost hope, but simply the plain, unremarkable fact of 2 bodies that were not, for whatever reason, made to create a third between them. Levi and Clara had grieved that absence together in the early years of their marriage, and had, by slow mutual agreement, made their peace with it long before her death, filling their modest house instead with a wide, generous garden Clara had loved tending, and a standing welcome to every neighbor child in the county who cared to visit, and a marriage that Levi would have told anyone, plainly and without a trace of self-pity, had been entirely full and entirely happy despite the one thing it had never held. He hired Marigold the autumn after Clara's death, needing a steady hand to keep his house through the hardest first winter of his grief, and it was over that year of quiet, careful work together, her cooking, her mending, her patient tending of the same garden Clara had once loved, that Levi Pike began to notice, with the particular unhurried attention of a man no longer in any rush to want things, exactly how much he had come to look forward to her company each evening. There was an evening in high summer, some 8 months into her employ, when Marigold found Levi sitting alone on the porch step long after supper, turning a small pressed flower between his fingers, one of Clara's own kept mementos, tucked into an old Bible he rarely opened, and she sat down beside him without being asked, the easy familiarity of months of shared work having long since worn away any awkwardness between them. "You don't have to sit with an old man's grieving, Marigold," Levi said, though he made no move for her to leave. "I don't sit with it out of duty, Levi," Marigold said. "I sit with it because I find I don't mind the quiet of it, and because a person carrying grief alone carries it heavier than a person who has somebody willing to just sit nearby while they do it." He looked at her a long moment in the fading light, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "Clara used to say near that exact thing," he said, word for word, near enough it startled me a little, hearing it again. "I didn't know her, Levy. I couldn't have borrowed her words if I tried." "I know," Levi said. That's rather the thing that startled me." Neither of them said anything further that evening, but Marigold noticed, in the weeks that followed, that Levi took to lingering on the porch of an evening rather more often than his ranch work strictly required, and that he had begun, without either of them remarking on it, setting 2 cups out for coffee each morning instead of one long before she ever came down to the kitchen herself. It was over the following months, through a long, hard winter and the slow thaw of a Kansas spring, that the easy partnership between them deepened into something neither had yet found the courage to name plainly. Small kindnesses exchanged without comment. The particular quiet comfort of 2 people who had each buried a version of the life they once expected and found, unlooked for, that they preferred each other's company to solitude regardless. He asked her to marry him on a cold evening in late October, plain and unadorned the way he did everything, standing in his own kitchen with his hat in his hands. "I find I have grown a good deal fonder of you than a hired woman's wages generally account for, Marigold," Levi said. "I am not a young man with a young man's romantic notions, and I do not offer you flowers or fine speeches. I offer you a steady house, honest company, and a man who has come, this past year, to believe his evenings are considerably poorer without you in them. I would be glad if you would marry me." Marigold Vance stood in that kitchen with her heart pounding, torn between the plain warmth of an offer she had not let herself hope for in 2 long years and the old familiar fear that had governed every careful decision she had made since Ohio. "You do not know the whole truth of me, Levi," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "I owe you that truth before I can give you any answer at all, and I fear, once you have heard it, the offer will not stand." "Say it plain, then," Levi said, gentle. "I've found plain truths generally easier to bear than the fearful waiting beforehand." "I cannot give you children," Marigold said, and the words came out of her in a rush she had rehearsed 100 times in 2 years and never once had the courage to speak aloud to anyone. "I was engaged once, in Ohio, to a man I loved entirely, and a physician confirmed, after 2 years of marriage, that I would very likely never bear a child. His mother called me unworthy of the family line the same week the news reached her, and Wendell accepted the annulment within the month, and I have spent every day since believing that any man who came to care for me would eventually make the same reckoning once he learned the truth, that a wife who cannot give a man a son is a wife not truly worth the keeping, whatever affection came before the knowing of it. I am telling you now, before you offer me your name, because I would rather lose this quietly, today, than watch you come slowly to the same conclusion Wendell's family reached in a single, cruel week." She braced herself, in the silence that followed, for the particular shape of rejection she had learned, in Ohio, to expect: the careful withdrawal, the search for gentler words to disguise the same cold calculation, the slow retreat of a man reconsidering an offer made before he had the full accounting, and found, watching Levi's still, unreadable face, that she could not yet tell which shape his silence was taking, only that it had already begun, and that the waiting itself felt very nearly as unbearable as the answer she feared. Levi Pike said nothing at all for a long moment. He set his hat down on the kitchen table and looked at her with an expression Marigold could not immediately read, and then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the house into the cold October evening, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen, with her confession still hanging in the air and her worst fear, she believed, already confirmed by his silence. He did not return that night, staying out past dark tending the stock in a manner that told her nothing at all of what he was thinking. and Marigold lay awake the whole of it convinced she had just watched the second good thing in her life dissolve for the same unforgivable reason as the first. She replayed the whole conversation 100 times in the dark, certain she could have found gentler words, certain a kinder telling might have softened whatever calculation he was surely making out in the cold barn, though some harder, wearier part of her knew plainly that no gentler wording would have changed the fact underneath it. What Marigold did not know, lying sleepless in her own small room, was that Levi Pike had walked out of that kitchen not in retreat, but in the particular overwhelmed silence of a man whose own old grief had risen up so suddenly and so completely that he did not trust himself to speak without weeping in front of her. For her confession had carried him straight back to a summer evening 15 years gone, sitting with Clara in a doctor's waiting room in Topeka, and the same raw ache of loving someone through a sorrow neither of them had chosen. He had gone to the barn not to reconsider his offer, but to master a grief 2 years buried that her honesty had, without either of them intending it, torn freshly open, and once he had mastered it enough to trust his own voice, he had realized that words alone would never carry the whole of what he meant to tell her, and had gone instead, the following dawn, to fetch his shovel. He was gone the whole of the next day, too, absorbed entirely in the digging, and Marigold, packing her small trunk with hands that would not quite stop shaking, told herself she had been a fool to hope a second time, and that the kindest thing left to do was to be gone from his house before he had to find the words to send her away himself. She folded her few dresses with the particular numb efficiency of a woman who has done this exact packing once before and knows precisely how to do it without feeling any of it too closely, and told herself, over and over, that she would be gone by the next morning's light, and that a second heartbreak survived was still, in its own grim way, evidence that a person could survive a great many things. It was near dusk on that second day, with her trunk packed and her resolve to leave nearly steeled, that Levi Pike came walking up from the lower field, carrying a shovel over one shoulder and a canvas sack over the other, his boots caked with 2 days' worth of dirt, and found her standing on the porch with her trunk beside her. "Where do you imagine you're going?" Levi said, not unkindly, setting down his tools. "I assumed, Levi, given your silence these 2 days, that you had reconsidered your offer, and I did not wish to make you say the words plainly," Marigold said, her voice catching despite her best effort to keep it steady. "I have not said one word in 2 days because I have been busy, Marigold, not because I was working up the nerve to send you away," Levi said. "Come with me. I have something to show you, and I find I would rather show it than explain it, on account of I've never been much good with speeches, even when I have my full wits about me. And I find I have precious few wits left after 2 days of hard digging." He led her down past the house to a stretch of ground she had walked past 100 times without particular notice, and there, in the fading October light, Marigold Vance found the whole of Levi Pike's answer laid out plain before her. 2 full days' labor had turned that neglected stretch of earth into a freshly dug, carefully tended garden bed, wider and more ambitious than anything a single man alone would ordinarily trouble himself to build. The soil turned and worked and already set with the first careful rows of bulbs and seed. "Clara and I never had children," Levi said, standing beside the fresh-turned earth with his hat in his hands again, though this time the gesture carried none of the uncertainty it had 2 nights before. "We grieved that a good long while, in our early years, same as I expect you grieved it in Ohio. But we built this instead, the garden up by the house, the one you've been tending all year without knowing the whole history of it, and I want you to understand plainly, Marigold, that Clara and I counted our marriage a full one despite it. Not because we told ourselves comfortable lies about being satisfied, but because a life together was never, either of us came to believe, only about what children it produced. It was about the whole of what two people built between them day by day with their own two hands. He gestured at the freshly dug bed before them. This is yours. Not Clara's garden, which you may go on tending to if you like, but a new one, started fresh, the two of us together, this very week, because I find I do not want a life with you that is merely a continuation of the life I already had. I want a new one, built new, exactly the shape the two of us decide to make it. Children or no children was never going to be the measure of what I'm offering you. I built you a garden instead, Marigold, because I find a garden says considerably more plainly than I ever could that I mean this life full, whatever shape it takes. Marigold Vance stood at the edge of that freshly turned earth in the last of the October light, and felt something in her that had been braced for rejection for 2 long years finally, entirely unclench. You are not sending me away, she said, wondering, disbelieving even as the evidence stood plain before her, her hand rising unbidden to press against her own mouth as though to hold in a sob that was as much relief as it was 2 years of carried grief, finally allowed to break. I spent 2 days digging instead of talking because I did not trust my own words to carry the weight of what I meant, and I did not want you spending a single hour longer believing the silence meant what it meant with Wendell, Levi said. I am asking you again, properly, standing here where I mean for you to see exactly what I'm offering, rather than merely hear it. Will you marry me, Marigold? Not despite what you told me. Because of the whole of what you told me, and because I have already lived a full, happy life built on exactly the shape of marriage you feared I would refuse, and I find I would like to build a second one with you. The kiss she gave him then, at the edge of a garden built in 2 days of silent, deliberate labor, was quiet and certain. And what broke open in Marigold was the plain astonishment of being chosen not despite her deepest fear, but entirely in spite of ever needing to fear it at all. They were married that November, quietly, at the little Larkin church, and the garden grew through that first winter and into the following spring, filling with exactly the bright, hardy flowers Marigold had always loved best, and had never, in 2 years of careful guarding, let herself plant anywhere she might grow attached to leaving behind. Before the spring planting had fully taken, trouble arrived in the shape of a fine carriage, and a face from Marigold's past she had hoped never to see again. Wendell Ashcroft came to Larkin that April, prosperous and considerably softer around the middle than Marigold remembered him, his fine coat and his carriage both marking him plainly as a stranger to the dusty little town's more modest sensibilities. He had inherited his family's full fortune the previous year upon his mother's death, and had lost, in a fever, the winter before, the second wife his mother had approved in Marigold's place, a marriage that had, by all account, produced no children either, a fact Wendell had learned to receive with rather more philosophical acceptance now that his own mother's judgment was no longer looking over his shoulder, though the irony of it had plainly never once occurred to him as he made his way west. He called at the Pike Ranch under the guise of a business traveler's chance detour, and Marigold, opening her own door to find him standing there, felt the whole old fear rise up in her chest before she had time to master it. Marigold. I confess I hardly believed it when a mutual acquaintance mentioned you'd settled in Kansas, Wendell said, with the easy, practiced charm she remembered too well. I find myself widowed again, and considerably wiser than the young fool who let his mother dictate his heart the first time. I have come to ask whether you might consider, given all that has passed, And given that I am now free of my mother's opinions on the matter entirely, a second chance between us. I find I never stopped regretting how badly I handled the whole affair. You are 2 years and 1 dead wife too late, Wendell, Marigold said, steady despite the old fear still humming beneath her composure, and I find I have already built the life you once told me I was unworthy of having. I am married, Wendell, happily, to a man who built me a garden with his own hands the same week I told him the truth you once used to cast me off. A rancher's garden, Wendell said, with the faint, condescending amusement of a man who had never once doubted his own superior claim. Marigold, be sensible. I can offer you a return to society, a fortune, a name that does not carry the whisper of a runaway engagement wherever it travels. Whatever this rancher has built, I promise you I can offer considerably more. It was Levi himself, arriving from the fields at that exact moment and taking in the whole scene with a single, unhurried glance, who answered before Marigold needed to. You can offer her a fortune, Ashcroft, and a name, and a return to a society that once let its opinion of a woman's worth be decided by whether her body could produce an heir, Levi said, coming to stand beside his wife with a quiet, immovable steadiness. I offered her a garden because I wanted her to understand, plainly, that I was not marrying a means to an heir. I was marrying her. I find that is a considerably better bargain than anything your fortune is likely to improve upon, and I'd be obliged if you'd get back in your fine carriage and let my wife finish her afternoon in peace. Wendell Ashcroft, unaccustomed to being refused so plainly by anyone, attempted one further appeal, a suggestion, delivered with less subtlety than he perhaps intended, that a rancher's modest circumstances could hardly compete long-term with the security his own restored fortune could guarantee, and that Marigold ought to consider her practical future rather than a passing sentiment. My practical future is standing right beside me, Wendell, with dirt still under his fingernails from the garden he built me, Marigold said, and there was nothing left in her voice of the old fear at all, only a hard, clear certainty 2 years in the making. You taught me, the week your mother called me unworthy, exactly what your kind of security is truly worth. I will take Levi's garden over your fortune every single day for the rest of my life, and I would thank you not to trouble either of us again. Wendell did not leave quite so easily as Marigold's plain refusal deserved. He lingered a further week in Larkin, calling at the general store and the church social alike, dropping careful, wounded remarks to anyone who would listen about a rancher's wife too proud to secure her own family's future, and about the particular oddness, he suggested, of a marriage that had produced no talk of children even a full year in, a whisper calculated, precisely as his mother once might have calculated it, to plant in the small town's mind exactly the kind of doubt that had once cost Marigold everything in Ohio. It very nearly worked. Larkin was a small town, and small towns talk, and by the second week several of the church social's more censorious matrons had begun exchanging the particular knowing glances that told Marigold, walking among them, that Wendell's whispers had found soil to take root in, regardless of how plainly she had refused him to his face. It was Levi who ended it, and he ended it in the one arena where a Kansas rancher's word still carried unimpeachable weight, the Larkin Cattlemen's meeting, held that same week in the church hall, with half the town's respectable men in attendance and Wendell Ashcroft, still lingering on his prolonged business detour, seated near the back. I understand there's been some talk this week about my marriage, Levi said, rising unbidden once the meeting's ordinary business had concluded, his voice carrying easily through the hushed hall. I'll settle it plain, since plain is the only way I know how to settle anything. My wife told me, before I ever asked for her hand, that she could not bear children, and I built her a garden the same week to tell her exactly what I thought of that fact, which is to say, nothing at all, beyond the simple truth that I love the woman and not merely whatever she might have produced for me. I understand a certain gentleman visiting our town has found it a subject worth gossiping over. I'd remind him, and anyone else inclined to repeat it, that a man who abandoned this same woman on his own mother's say-so has considerably less standing to judge what makes a marriage worth keeping than the rest of you do. Wendell Ashcroft's face went a dull, furious red as every eye in the hall turned toward him, and he found, in the sudden weight of that collective attention, that his careful whispering campaign had just been answered a great deal more publicly and a great deal more thoroughly than he had bargained for. He left the hall without another word, and left Larkin entirely 2 days later, his fine carriage raising dust down the same road he had arrived on. Word reached the town within the month, through the same mutual acquaintance who had first mentioned Marigold's whereabouts, that he had married a third time before the year was out, to a young woman his own restored mother figure's social circle had approved, and that the marriage was already, by all early report, a cold and unhappy one built on precisely the calculations that had once cost him the one woman who might have loved him, honestly. The garden at the Pike Ranch grew wider every year after that, Marigold and Levi working it together each spring with the same patient, unhurried partnership that had built the first bed in 2 days of silent October labor, and the flowers she had once been too afraid to plant anywhere she might have to leave behind bloomed, instead, in a garden she tended for the whole of a long and settled life. The Marigolds themselves, planted first in that October bed and spread, year by year, to border the whole of the property's front walk, became something of a small local landmark, and more than one Larkin bride in the years that followed asked Marigold for cuttings to carry in her own wedding bouquet, having heard by then the whole quiet story of the garden, and finding in it exactly the kind of blessing a nervous young bride hoped to carry down the aisle. They took in, over the years, more than one motherless child of the county who needed a warm house and a patient hand. A neighbor's orphaned nephew one hard winter, a runaway girl no older than 14 the following spring, a widowed hand's small daughter for the better part of a year while her father remarried and settled, not out of any lingering ache for the children they had never made themselves, but because Levi had taught her, that first October evening, that a family's shape was never fixed by blood alone, and Marigold found she had a great deal of love left over to spend on whoever needed it, exactly as generously as Levi and Clara once had before her. Each child who passed through that house learned, before they left it, the whole story of the Marigold bed by the door, and carried the lesson of it onward long after they had grown and gone, the same way a garden, properly tended, always outlasts the single season that first planted it. Levi never did become a man of many words, even in the long happy years that followed, but Marigold found she had stopped needing him to be. She had learned, standing at the edge of a freshly turned garden bed on a cold October evening, exactly how much a man could say with a shovel and 2 days of silent labor, and she counted herself, for the whole of the rest of her settled life, the richer for having a husband who chose to answer her deepest fear, not with a speech, but with something that would go on growing long after any words could have faded from memory. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived not through what a person could provide, but through the whole of who they simply were, then this story was for you. Out on the tall grass of Kansas, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Levi Pike and the woman who feared she was unworthy of it became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. She told him the truth that once cost her everything. He picked up a shovel and built her an answer no words could have said better. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, old wounds, and the kind of quiet courage only the West seems to demand speak to something in you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.